show a picture of my daughter. I'm going to start that way. This is a recent picture of Junia and my wife Anna at my in-laws' house. Junia is 3 years old and has hit a new stage with a new favorite phrase. Her new favorite phrase these days is, "No, you're wrong." It doesn't matter. Like, Junia, the sky is blue. "No, you're wrong." Like, that is up. "No, you're wrong." I have never known so little as I know right now. It's amazing. But she is like panicked about like things that are right and wrong. Like if you say something, you just like misspeak and don't correct it, she like freaks out. She'll like melt down in tears. Like, "You're wrong, you're wrong." It's like, whoa, where did you get it? I have no idea where she got that from. I'm trying to figure it out. Alright, so it's not that hard to figure out where she got it from. It came from me. My entire life, more or less, I have to admit, and it's brokenness, but it's true, I've been really obsessed, I think, in certain ways, with being right. It has a high value. I mean, there's positive ways to say that. But in me, it's something disordered. And it's something I think I've experienced some transformation in, but it's still a dynamic that's discernible in my life. I sometimes describe it in a rather kind of cartoonish way when I describe who I was as a freshman in college. And it was pretty stark then. I thought I knew just about everything. I knew that I was right, and I knew that everyone else was wrong. It was that kind of stance was the jumping off point of a whole bunch of stuff that God did in my life during college. Like, that was the thing that God put his finger on. I was obsessed with being right, especially when it came to things of God. And when it came to the life of faith, I was obsessed with being right. Ironically, I think that came from maybe what we consider to be opposite of that kind of dynamic that was at work in my life. I mean, that is, I think I was obsessed with being right, especially when it came to God, because at my core, I struggled so much with doubt. And it just about wrecked me, because at that point in my life, as far as I could tell, doubt was the one thing that God would not tolerate. Or to put it another way, as far as I could tell, faith was the one thing that God commanded that you have, that you kind of bring to the table, right? As I understood it, there were two religious camps in the world. Those who thought that God required faith, and those that thought that God required works, good works. Well, the folks who were in the second camp would think, like, maybe you just had to, like, do enough good things, and then you kind of earn your way into God's good graces. Maybe just, like, more good than bad, or something like that. But I had heard loud and clear growing up that wasn't the way that the world worked. No, God didn't require works. You just couldn't be good enough for God. It was just impossible. What God demanded, rather, was faith. And you didn't have to be good enough, but you certainly had to believe enough. And you certainly had to believe rightly. And if you couldn't believe, if you couldn't bring faith to the table, well, we already got rid of works. What else did you have left? And so there's this kind of obsession, right, with faith, and where it came from, how you make sure you had enough of it, and how to keep doubt from like crawling into your life. And today I want to talk about one of the Bible passages that God's used most powerfully in my life. It's from the Gospel of Mark, the oldest of the ancient accounts of the life of Jesus that are in the Bible. And as far as I can tell, I'm taking a look, I don't think I've actually ever preached on this particular passage before, as important as it is, and as it's been for me in my life. I haven't spoken specifically on this passage, but if you've been around ECP, my hunch is that you've heard at least the punchline of this story before. You'll see when you get there. But it's a story from the Gospel of Mark, and a Bible study on the Gospel of Mark basically was like a turning point in my life. Early in college, my freshman year, was a part of a Bible study that read through the entire Gospel of Mark in a year and spent time really wrestling with it. A whole year is actually a long time to spend on a book as short as the Gospel of Mark. We really dug in and asked questions, and we prayed through it. We wrestled. We would have Bible study, and then we would go to dinner right afterwards. And we would just be still wrestling over, what on earth does Jesus mean? What is this about? This is one of those passages that really changed things for me. And I want to look at this story today because through it, I think God has something to say to us about belief, about faith, about trust. Something to say to us about what it is, and just as importantly, what it is not. And I think that God wants to free us from some unrealistic, unreasonable expectations that we have about faith and invite us in a new way. So, before we do that, let me just pray for us. So, Lord, I just ask that you would be here this afternoon as we encounter you here in this text. I pray that you would speak to us through your word. Lord, and I pray that for each one of us as we're here and as we're hearing from you, we're kind of puzzling over some things. I pray, Lord, that you would help us go deeper than just our kind of front doors of our minds. That you would call to mind things in our lives, places that you want to speak into, things that are maybe that we brought in with us into this room today, things that are waiting for us back on the other side of those doors. Lord, would you speak to us in the real things of life itself? Come, Lord. Amen. All right, so as we look at this story, it's in Mark chapter 9, the latter half of the chapter, if you want to look at it later. As we look at the story, I want to give us a bit of context, kind of give us a running start at the story. Because it comes at the end of a lot of action in the Gospel of Mark. Really, I think is kind of the pivot point of the entire Gospel, the turning point where a lot of things come together and some mysteries get answered and mysteries get set up. Anyway, not long before this, in chapter 8, Jesus asked his disciples who they thought he was. It's one of these pivotal questions. Right? No one knows in the Gospel of Mark who Jesus is. And then in chapter 8, Jesus asks his disciples, who do you say that I am? And Peter, it seems, he answers famously. It seems like he comes up with the right answer. Right? He says, "You are the Messiah." And come to find out, as far as I can tell, in the Gospel of Mark, I think that's the right answer. Right? Junia would be stoked, right? Peter gets it right. But Peter getting this question right has actually a surprising outcome, if you know the story. Because right after Peter says that he believes that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus goes on to clarify what that meant. Jesus says, look, yes, correct. Let me tell you what that means. It means I'm going to suffer and I'm going to die. I'm actually going to rise again, but Peter gets stuck on the suffering and dying part, right? And feeling as good as he does, Peter at that moment, having gotten it right, he kind of said, "You are the Messiah." Peter's feeling pretty good, so good about himself that in fact he takes it upon himself to correct Jesus on that whole suffering and dying thing. Peter's like, I don't think you know. I said you were Messiah. That's got to be true, and Messiahs don't suffer and die. So no, that's actually not how it's going to go. The result is that Jesus rebukes Peter, it says, and he gives us a crazy line, "Get behind me, Satan." Peter, that's Peter, like Saint Peter, Satan. Okay, and Jesus goes on, right, after this kind of famous statement, he goes on and he doubles down on this suffering and dying thing. He says, no, I tell you, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, and more than that, any of you who would want to be my followers, you're going to have to, there's suffering is part of the deal too, you're going to have to take up your cross, and you're going to have to come follow me. You have to lay down your life. All right, all of that happens. Then Jesus takes Peter and two of his other disciples, so just Jesus and 3 of the 12. They go up to a mountain for kind of a special outing, a field trip of sorts, right? What has come to be known as the Transfiguration. Jesus is transfigured. His appearance changes. He gets all sparkly and otherworldly. Moses and Elijah show up. Admittedly, it's a really weird story. But the purpose of this whole thing is plain enough. At this really crucial moment, right, in the gospel, where Jesus' identity and purpose are being called into question by Peter and by others, God shows up and decides the matter once and for all. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my son, the beloved, listen to him." Where I want to pick up the story is on the way down from the mountain. On the way down from the mountain, the disciples come down, and Mark says, when they came, that is Jesus and the three that were with him, when they came to the disciples, to the rest of them, they saw a great crowd around them, and some scribes arguing with them. When the whole crowd saw him, saw Jesus, they were immediately overcome with awe, and they ran forward to greet him. Jesus asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" Someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought you my son. He has a spirit that makes him unable to speak, and whenever it seizes him, it dashes him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. And I asked your disciples to cast it out, but they could not do so." So things aren't going well. The three and Jesus have had this kind of amazing, literally mountaintop experience. But the 9 who didn't go, right, are having a hard go of it. They're trying to cast out a demon, and it's not working. And Jesus comes down to find a dissatisfied customer. It tells him this story, right? And Jesus' response is, he says, "You faithless generation, how much longer must I be among you? How much longer must I put up with you? Bring him to me." And this is where the theme of this passage, the faith, trust, belief, they're all actually the same word in Greek. This theme of faith is introduced, and we'll see it pop up a couple more times before we're done. It's this really complex, kind of rich complex of ideas involving belief for sure, but also trust, fidelity, loyalty. This is cognitive. It has to do with things that happen in your mind, but it's also much more than that. It has to do with what you do, where you put your trust, where your heart is located. So with this phrase, faithless generation, Jesus sets the topic, but he also strikes, I think what we'd all agree, is a pretty harsh tone, right? If you were Jesus' PR guy, this would be the sort of stuff that would keep you up at night. Right? This is not the way to win friends and influence people. In fact, this is perhaps the realization of our worst religious nightmares. It seems like if you don't have faith, Jesus doesn't even want to deal with you. He doesn't want to have to put up with you. This is a grim picture of faith, one with which I admit I've struggled. As I said, it's a picture that at times has made a certain amount of sense to me. If you can't bring faith to the table, I mean, what else do you have? Why else would God want to deal with you? This is maybe our greatest fear about God, that God would see the weakness of our faith, our brokenness, our feeble piety, and God simply wouldn't want to be around us. Jesus, sure, he's God with us, but perhaps he's not a God who's glad to be with us, it seems from this passage, right? Rather, it seems we get a confirmation that, in fact, God would kind of hate hanging out with us. He would count down the days until he wouldn't have to be with us anymore. And that can sound like what's going on, right? The hard thing is that, of course, we know from the rest of the life of Jesus that this is like the opposite of his character. Jesus loved to be with people. He loved especially to be with broken people. So what's going on, right? I think if we press on, we get a better sense of what Jesus is getting at here. It goes on. It says, they brought the boy to him. And when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell down on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked the father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. It has often cast him into the fire and into the water to destroy him. If you're able to do anything, have compassion on us and help us." The question Jesus asks, how long has this been happening to him? When he sees the spirit throw this boy on the ground, how long? How long? The words echo Jesus' exasperated cry from before, right? How long? How long are you going to be faithless? How long will you continue to suffer the consequences of your own brokenness? And from the Bible's point of view, at least in the big picture, this boy suffering from this demon is in the big picture a result of human brokenness and sin. And it pains Jesus to see it up close and personal. Not because he's disgusted by it, but because his heart breaks to see the pain that we put ourselves in. I take it that this is so often Jesus' response to our sin. It does frustrate him, no doubt. It definitely frustrates him. It pains him. when we're unfaithful to him, disloyal to him, when we turn once again to that addiction, when we give in once again to anger, to lust, to envy, when once again we trust not in God's goodness, but in our own good plans, when we despair of hope at all. Jesus mourns with us. He cries out with us, how long? How long, Matt, will you persist in losing your temper? How long will you fear for your future instead of trusting in me? How long? And so let me ask you, what is Jesus mourning in your life? Where is Jesus looking at your life and mourning the cycle of sin that just keeps going, the suffering that just won't end? I believe that for each one of us here today, there's a place in our lives where Jesus is looking at our lives and he's saying, how long? How long is that going on? How long is it going to keep going on? And he's frustrated, sure. And he's disappointed for us. He's weeping for us. In some cases, he's weeping with us. He's crying out, how long? How long has it been like this? How much have you suffered? Are you ready to let it go? Are you ready at least to stop suffering alone, to stop suffering in your own arrogance, your obsession with being right, your own obsession with being certain? Do you believe that it's possible for Jesus to break that never-ending cycle of brokenness? That cycle of addiction, that cycle of self-hatred, of anger, that cycle of rage, of lust, of self-obsession? Do you believe that it's possible? And after years of pain and sorrow, this is the question that the man asks himself. And his request of Jesus captures this weariness. From childhood, this demon has been tormenting my son for years. All of the hopes I had for my child are gone. We've had to accommodate ourselves to a life where my son is constantly tormented. But if you're able to do anything, if there's anything you can do, have compassion on us and help us. There's disciples can't. They're just the last in a long line of disappointments. But if there's anything you can do. Jesus picks up on the Father's exhaustion, and he calls him out on it. If you are able, all things can be done. All things are possible for the one who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out, I believe, help my unbelief. At first blush, at least, this seems like a total contradiction, this paradoxical combination. I believe, help my unbelief. It just captures the Father's heart in that moment, his weariness, his brokenness. It's like he's saying, fine, if belief is what it takes to see my son healed, then shoot, I believe. But I know I'm not all the way there, so I worry, what if I don't have enough? You ask for belief. But Jesus, can you help me with that? I believe. Help my unbelief. It's a contradiction, but it's so honest, right? And it's enough that Jesus goes ahead and he heals the boy. When Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, You spirit that keeps this boy from speaking and hearing, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. After crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, He's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he was able to stand. It's amazing, right? We can just imagine the years and years of this father. Suddenly, this moment, this encounter with Jesus, transformation happened. But there's still this nagging issue, right? Why couldn't the disciples cast out this demon? And that's exactly what the disciples asked Jesus after this. They get him in private. And they ask him plainly, why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, this kind can come out only through prayer. This kind can come out only through prayer. Fair enough, you might say. Good tip, Jesus. I'll remember that for next time. Prayer. Sounds good. But who prayed? Right? Did anyone pray? Who prayed? It's confusing, right? Confusing enough that some ancient scribes actually tried to fix this text. They said, this makes no sense. So they tried to fix it by adding in the phrase "and fasting." So maybe even in your Bibles, that's what it said. This kind can come only by prayer and fasting. Which basically was the experience of what happened in the communities of the scribes who were copying this text. They said, well, we know how to cast out demons. It's prayer and fasting. And so that at least made the text make a little bit more sense to them. Of course, nobody fasted in this text either. So they're just kind of beg the question. But let's think about it. Did Jesus pray? In the vineyard, we'll sometimes call what Jesus did like a prayer of command or something like that. But as useful as I find that language, no one in the ancient world used it, so I don't think that's what the text is trying to say. Did someone pray silently? Jesus, perhaps? Again, we can kind of imagine, like right before he did it or something, Jesus is praying. Again, in the ancient world, you didn't pray silently. You prayed out loud. You didn't read silently either. Just wasn't as much like kind of imaginative psychology going on. So I don't think anybody wrote this textbook and no, he's praying, it's just silent. So who prayed? I think it has to be the only person who said anything that could even sound like a prayer. It has to be the Father. He's the only one who spoke. He's the one who cried out to God, to Jesus. We don't exactly know, but he cries out, I believe, help my unbelief. This most modest, most honest outburst, this is the prayer that had the power to cast out this demon. This is the prayer that unlocked what had held this boy in bondage for a decade and what 9 of the 12 apostles could not cast out. This is it, right? This is this incredibly powerful prayer. I believe. Help my unbelief. Even in the context of this incredibly spiritual experience, even in the context of this high-octane Jesus event, right? It just came down from the Transfiguration. You don't have to know what that is. You just need to know that it has this fancy name, right? It's like a pretty, fireworks, spiritual fireworks kind of thing. Even with all that going on, the example lifted up is this modest, almost embarrassingly modest prayer. I believe. Help my unbelief. And this prayer isn't just accepted. Jesus says it's the key to the whole thing. This kind only comes out through prayer. It gives you hope, right? And that was my first encounter when we came to this text. That was what we talked about over dinner that week when we were here in the Gospel of Mark during my freshman year. That counts as faith? That or that prayer is allowed? I didn't know we were allowed to ask for faith. I thought that was the only thing that I had. That was my end of the bargain was faith. But I can ask for that. That can't be. I think it's true. This counts. This is possible. This is a prayer we can pray. It's a prayer that Jesus, I think, suggests we ought to pray. I often tell a story here about a particular Sunday several years ago now. A Sunday in which a few kind of amazing things happened, but the one I think I tell most often is about my wife Hannah and Josh praying for a man whose knee was busted and he couldn't walk when he came in and took off his cast and took off his brace and he's there after they prayed for him and he's running around. It's an amazing story, right, of healing. It's an amazing thing to see God work in that kind of miraculous intervention. The part of that story I think I tell less often, I may have told it once, is my story from earlier that day. So the morning of the great healing. Where was Pastor Matt? Pastor Matt was on the front steps of his apartment, figuring that he probably shouldn't go to church. We had a conference that weekend on healing. It was great. It was encouraging us to, the conference was encouraging us to kind of expect to see God move and work. And those are things that I've seen and I think are super important. But there's always a certain amount of insecurity that comes up in me. It's not kind of like my natural gifting. And so that weekend had been really challenging for me. I had all these kind of old things about doubt that come up for me. We had been thinking about healing. You're going to think about faith. There are some abusive ways to connect those two things, but if you're going to read the Bible and think about healing, faith is something, is a role to play somewhere. And as we were kind of thinking about that all that weekend, I just kind of got in this like nagging sense, like gnawing at me again and again and again. Like your doubt is going to like sink this ship. Like you better get out, or like nothing good is going to happen. Your doubt is toxic. You are toxic, and you need to. Like, if you want healing, this whole service is supposed to be a healing service. If you want healing to happen in this service, you better not go. And I was really wrestling with it. I was trying to figure out how I could explain to who that I couldn't be there. In the middle of that, I didn't want to go, right? I was so condemned for not having enough faith. In the middle of that, this text, right, came back to my mind. I believe, help my unbelief. And I just remember just kind of grabbing hold of that. I still felt the condemnation, right? But I was just like, no, I think this is possible. I think this is an allowable place for me to be. Like, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. I just remember just praying it again and again and again and again and again. And I'm saying, if I didn't know that prayer was legit, I wouldn't have shown up that afternoon, for sure. It's so powerful. And think about what I think about all that I would have missed out that day, the faith-building experience it was to actually show up and say, well, here I am, broken. I doubt. I feel like there's always this part of my mind that's just always checking out. Oh yeah, you can explain everything here. Doubt, recourse to God. I had that track going on. Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. It's so powerful simply to know that this prayer is legit, that it's acceptable, that if it's all you can muster, it's okay. It's enough. In fact, over the years, I've come to believe that this prayer isn't just acceptable. I think in certain ways it may actually be preferable to certain things that we might otherwise imagine to be more robust and more faith-filled prayers. And I think it's precisely because of the tension in the two parts of this prayer, right? If you want to pray this, the first thing, of course, the hardest thing maybe is that you just have to choose to believe. You just have to choose to believe that the Father does this. And in the passage, I think it's in direct contrast, right, to this unbelieving generation, this faithless generation, caught in never-ending cycles of doubt and distrust and living in the pain that results from that kind of distrust of God. The Father's prayer instead begins with an exercise of the will. He simply makes a choice, nevertheless, to believe, to trust. Despite everything that is telling him not to believe, despite years of disappointment and heartache, this man nevertheless chooses to believe. He chooses to trust. And yet at the same time, if you want to pray this prayer, right, you have to also admit your insufficiency. Unlike Peter, right, who thinks that the moment that he has the right answer, he's got it all figured out and can therefore go boss Jesus around. The father of this boy, his father recognizes his insufficiency. It's not just that I can't do what it would take to earn God's favor. It's also that I can't believe enough either. Even when it comes to faith, I don't have what it takes in and of myself. And so in saying, help my unbelief, you admit your insufficiency and you recognize your dependence. You say, even the thing that I thought that was my end in the bargain, really, Jesus, I still depend on you for that. Everything is possible for the one who believes. Well, this is what I believe. I believe that you can supply even my lack of belief. I believe, help my unbelief. This is the prayer that Jesus says is able to cast out this stubborn demon. You admit your deficiency. You recognize your dependence. You invest in relationship with Jesus. The statement, help my unbelief, is in recognizing that even the faith we need comes from the one whom we desire to, in whom we desire to believe. It establishes like this dynamic relationship of trust. It's like I trust you. I'm just gonna like make a choice. And yet, can you help me learn to trust you more? Because I'm not where I want to be. That's a relationship where you're not off like preparing in advance. Everything happens in the relationship. I don't have to go kind of work out this thing, and then I can go talk to Jesus. Even my faith, even my belief, I can work out in conversation, dialogue, relationship. I believe, help my belief. It's Jesus' paradigm for faith, for effective prayer. And I take it that it's especially important and it's especially powerful model when, like this father, you've been struggling with something for a long time. When the length of the weight itself begins to eat away at your faith. Whether it's a habit or an addiction that you just can't shake, a pattern of sin that you thought you had beat that keeps coming back, an illness that you've been living with for just too long. Jesus mourns these things in our lives and invites us to come to him in faith, in trust. Because more even than a healing or any other good thing that Jesus wants for us, what erodes most quickly is our ability to trust God. Not trust God for something, not trust God to do something, not trust that God will make everything better. I simply mean our basic ability to trust God. Period. More than anything else, that's the tragedy when we've been struggling for a long time. That's what Jesus mourns most of all. That's what this boy's father had quite nearly lost, what needed verbal affirmation in the form of his prayer. I trust you. Help my worn out ability to trust. I trust you. Help me rebuild my trust in you. Years spent watching his son suffer had eroded his ability to trust God, and Jesus gives him an opportunity to articulate that kernel of trust that was still left. That glowing ember that still dared to believe that Jesus could supply even the trust that he was lacking. So let me ask you, what has eroded your ability to trust God? What has eroded your ability to trust God? What's been kind of wearing it down over time? Is it something that you've been waiting for from God for what seems like forever? A cycle of brokenness in your own life? Did someone close to you prove untrustworthy and it makes it hard to even to imagine trusting, or especially maybe to imagine trusting God? All things can be done for the one who believes. Can you choose to believe? Can you admit when you don't believe? Can you ask faith from Jesus and invest in that relationship of trust with him? The second question for us this afternoon, I think, is this, and it's kind of the whole thing, I guess. How is Jesus inviting you to choose to believe? For some of you, it may be that the whole life of faith, just the whole question of relating to Jesus, just the whole possibility, right, of relating to God, has remained something where you just feel like it's kind of beyond what you can believe. You can't muster up the faith that you know or think is required. And so you've never taken that plunge to really dive into life with God. If that's where you're at, I think this prayer is a gift for you today. I believe Help my unbelief. I choose to believe. And one of the things I choose to believe is that God can handle my doubt. That's where you're at today. I want to encourage you. Jesus is ready and willing to answer that prayer. Or maybe you've been following Jesus for a while, but there's that habitual cycle of sin in your life, and years of struggling with that without seeing much breakthrough have started to take their toll, and you doubt whether Jesus could really do anything about it at this point. There's just some part of your life that you think, I don't know, it's been too long. There's an invitation from Jesus today to choose to believe, to choose to trust Jesus. I believe, help him. Or maybe it's somebody else's sin. You've just lived too long with the results of somebody else's brokenness in your life, and you've lost hope that they'll ever change, or that you'll ever recover, that you'll ever be made whole again. Maybe it's your marriage. Our marriages can so easily become places in which our own cycles of sin and our spouse's brokenness just become these convoluted messes of sin and brokenness. And if we're not careful, we can begin to lose hope. And maybe you're here today and you're beginning to lose your ability to trust God to work in your marriage. I've been there. And you see an old pattern of relating that just won't change. And when Jesus says that all things are possible for the one who believes, the best we can manage is, fine, I guess I believe. But you're going to have to help that substantial helping of unbelief. Right? A big portion of my heart is just like, I'm not sure I can believe for that anymore. If that's where you're at, take that step this afternoon. It's such an important one. To just choose to believe and say, all right, I trust you to the rest. Whatever it is, there's an invitation for God for you this afternoon to choose to believe, to bring all of that doubt, all of that distrust that's built up, and nevertheless trust that Jesus can handle even the distrust. Believe